On July 16th, 2015, the YouTube channel AccelJoe was created. The aforementioned channel uploaded multiple different videos showcasing music from obscure video games you may or may not have ever known about. For example, have you ever heard about the game Falcata? It was one of the few launch titles released for the PlayStation 1, but never saw release outside of Japan. It's definitely a video game. But what makes Falcata stand out isn't its graphics, its board game-like structure, or its RPG elements. It's the soundtrack. When this music randomly popped into my YouTube feed, I was blown away. How could such an obscure, and quite honestly terrible game, have some really sick music holding the whole thing together? Nobody would have ever known, not until AccelJoe archived and uploaded most of Falcata's soundtrack. And it didn't stop there. One console the channel would frequently upload and showcase music for was the PC-98. If you've never heard of the PC-98, all you really need to know is that it was a home computer released only in Japan, and it had quite a few good games on it. The original Toho was released on this system, as well as a plethora of porn games. Over the years, there's been a stronger preservation effort for the PC-98 library, but there's still a lot of hidden gems in there with some really nice soundtracks. Have a listen. It's quite a shame to see all of this hard work go unnoticed. Developers at the time poured their heart, soul, and pussy into their games, only for it to be forgotten decades later. I can't testify as to whether or not these games have a stronger presence in Japan, but the efforts of fans in the West trying to make these games more known to the public is greatly appreciated, even if half the time it goes unnoticed. AccelJoe was not a big channel by any means, and most of his videos never broke past 100 views. But the dedication can be clearly seen and is well respected. So, with all that being said, on June 21st, 2022, the YouTube channel had been terminated due to copyright infringement, effectively erasing, no exaggeration, thousands upon thousands of YouTube videos. Falcata's soundtrack, as well as other mentioned PC-98 games' soundtrack, would now become lost media. Alright, so let me clarify something real quick. When I say lost media, that's not to say copies of games like Falcata don't exist. There are still plenty of copies on eBay, and the ROM can surely be found through a quick Google search. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is, without the efforts of one random dude who dedicated his channel to showcasing these obscure games, Falcata might as well have been lost media. There's only about 7 videos of the game online, and you don't typically hear anyone bring it up in discussions. Falcata and those 3 PC-98 games are just one example, but there are hundreds upon thousands of video games that share the same issues of not being preserved. Sure, you may be able to find the ROM somewhere, but honestly and truly, we don't know anything about these games. And these games are only ever brought to light when someone chooses to do so. The question I would like to ask is this: why would anyone ever seek out the removal of these preservation efforts? Could it be because of piracy? Companies trying to impose intimidation? Nobody truly knows. But what I can tell you is that it makes no fucking sense to target someone uploading music from a porn game released in 1991. With that being said, I'd like to now talk about the importance of preservation and why it should be everyone's duty to actively make sure you never lose your physical media and/or whatever files you may have. I'll mostly be talking about games, but I'll try to bring up other topics as well as we go along. Okay, remember how I just said that preservation of physical media is important? Well, I kinda lied. I'd like to preface that yes, there is more to physical preservation than just preserving the actual video game. It's important to document other factors like its original casing, the manual, anything extra like a map or something. But there's a major problem that has only become more prevalent over time. What happens to physical media when it becomes too old? Well, the obvious answer would be to try and fix it to the best of your abilities. And while temporary solutions may exist, permanent ones don't. Those cartridge games you've been collecting, they'll cease to exist due to a thing called bit rotting. Those CD games you've been collecting as well, they'll also cease to exist due to disk rotting. Now listen, there are many factors as to what causes video game degradation, and I'm not trying to imply that any of this will happen in our lifetime, but it's important to keep in mind that nothing lasts forever. There will be a point in time where all of this physical media becomes inaccessible, and once this inevitable future comes to fruition, there will more than likely never be an official way to play Kung Fu for the Amiga CD32. Okay, remember how I just said nothing lasts forever? Well, I kind of lied. Again. Through the hard work and dedication of the video game community, everyone's been doing their part in preserving history. Those games that will inevitably rot over time, every single one of them has been dumped online and free to download across multiple websites. Additionally, any console you can think of has more than likely been emulated and has been accessible to the public for many years. But here comes another problem: the legality behind emulation and ROM dumping. To make a long and very frustrating story short, since the dawn of emulation, it has been and always will be seen as an act of piracy, even though a string of court cases proved otherwise. That didn't stop companies like Nintendo actively pushing the ideology that any form of emulation is illegal, and will seek out different ways to target these emulators and ROM sharing sites. Very recently, they've taken down Nintendo Switch emulator Yuzu, and in turn have also taken down Nintendo 3DS emulator Citra. The issue is the bad precedent this case in particular presents. While we may be fine for now, that may be very different in the future. I'd like to now argue why emulation should be legal, and why you shouldn't be afraid to download and emulate video games. Look, the amount of video games that have been released up until now is something neither you or I could determine. And one could argue that it's unreasonable to expect game companies to re-release even a fraction of what they've produced. I mean, some of these game companies don't even exist anymore, so what do? But I'd like to ask, should it be illegal to emulate Thousand Arms for the PlayStation 1? A unique JRPG dating sim that has not been re-released since 1998. Companies like Nintendo seem to think so, according to their justifications against emulation. That's just one example, but there do exist a plethora of popular games that have never, and more than likely will never, see a modern release. For example, did you know that Hideo Kojima, famously known for his award-winning game, Penguin Adventure, made a cyberpunk visual novel called Snatcher? It's had numerous ports across console generations, but has only ever been localized to the West on the Sega CD. It's a shame because the game is really good, it's unique, it's innovative, and it would essentially set the groundwork for Kojima's later projects. Whoopee Camp created Tomba's 1 and 2 for the PlayStation 1. Both games were incredibly fun and stylish platformers, with the second game being one that I personally grew up with. It has not seen a re-release since the PlayStation 3, and while you can still technically purchase it today, there's no guarantee that the store will exist much longer. We're all familiar with Nintendo shutting down their services, but Microsoft also recently announced they'd be closing the Xbox 360 store. If Sony were to follow suit, they'd be effectively erasing a lot of re-releases that only currently exist on the PS3 store, a console that has been discontinued since 2016. I'm not going to pretend that piracy isn't an issue, but in the case of these few examples, it should not be an issue for fans to preserve and experience these games when their developers aren't even bothered to try and re-release them to a modern format. It's not in their best interest. There do exist companies like Limited Run Games that try to push for physical releases of forgotten titles. The entire Gex trilogy is getting re-released, the previously mentioned Tomba 1 is also getting re-released, and quite recently, stupid joke games like Plumbers Don't Wear Ties have been re-released. The fucking 3DO game Plumbers Don't Wear Ties has been re-released to a modern format. Are you fucking kidding me? But there is a huge problem with limited run games, and it's in its very name. Is it truly preservation if their stock is limited? Also, they're a bit of a shady company, but that's besides the point. But beyond all that, there's one major factor a lot of people don't seem to realize. Who in their right mind would realistically purchase an old console from the 1980s that more than likely wouldn't be able to hook up to your modern TV, only to play a small handful of games that may pique your interest? Whereas emulation is arguably more accessible than any console currently on the market. It's had years of fine-tuning to make each experience as perfect as it can be, and is completely free besides buying a dedicated console or computer to emulate your video games. The reason that developers create these emulators, and why so many people dump copies of their games online, isn't because they want to pirate some video games. It's because they want to ensure that these games never go away, to make sure that they can be experienced in the best way possible. Companies like Nintendo have continuously proven that the preservation of their games isn't a priority, only drip-feeding a handful of games every so often for their services, and even releasing unpolished disasters such as the Nintendo 64 emulator on launch for the Switch. So why should we, the consumer, the fan base, the gamers, accept actions such as these? But listen, nobody likes to break the law. So let's live in a theoretical world where emulation doesn't exist. The only way to play these games are through official means. How much are you realistically paying? I'm sure you all know where this is going. Let's not beat around the bush. Video games aren't cheap, and they're only becoming more expensive as time goes on. There will more than likely be a future where video games push the $59.99 barrier and start retailing for $69.99. We've already seen it for games such as Tears of the Kingdom and Persona 3 Reload. But listen, we're not here to talk about that nonsense. Let's talk about what's really on everyone's mind. Why the fuck is the original Final Fantasy VII more expensive than the remake? Oh, you know, the critically acclaimed 1997 RPG that sold close to... oh, only 10 million units. There are a lot of factors as to why older games have become outrageously expensive, and while they've thankfully declined in price over time, they'll never be the same price as they once were. But back on track, we're living in a theoretical world with no emulation. How difficult is it to play these games? Let's take a look at Persona 2, for example. You'd need to buy a console, which will price at $60, not too bad. Then we'd need some type of converter. You could buy a PS3 for a little bit more, but let's say we'll just buy a converter for $15. Now we just need the game, which is... Not the cheapest. But there you go, you can now legally play this game, and it only costed you $500. Except there's a slight issue. You see, Persona 2 was actually a two-part story. The first game, Persona 2 Innocent Sin, was originally released in Japan. Atlus then made the wise decision to only localize the second game, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. But thankfully though, both games were ported to the PSP. That's great! Atlus then made the genius decision to only localize the first game. Don't worry though, it'll only cost us an additional $400! Okay, so to recap, in order to legitimately experience the story of Persona 2, you need to play the second game, which was only localized on the PlayStation 1. Then you need to play the first game that was only localized on the PSP. All totaling out to almost $1,000. And that's one of many more examples that you'll encounter when trying to purchase secondhand video games. It is completely unreasonable to ask people to pay this much money to officially play an obscure video game that will likely never see a re-release. And to be quite honest, it's unreasonable to ask anyone to pay even a quarter of what some of these games are worth. I understand that rarity exists, and I won't argue that games like Magic Knight Rayearth or Rule of Rose have justified prices due to their limited print run, but why am I paying $80 to play Super Metroid? Why am I paying $150 to play Xenogears? Why am I paying $250 to play Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3? All of these games have sold over 1 million units worldwide. They're not rare by any stretch of the word. And quite honestly, it feels like gatekeeping. Like, you want me to officially play Silent Hill 2, but only if I pay $150 to get the PlayStation 2 version? I mean, that's unreasonable. Look, the case in point is this. What I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't feel bad for emulating video games. People have made it impossible to officially enjoy these games anymore. Emulation has become a necessity. I know I've made most of this video's topic revolve around the justification of emulation, but let's rewind a bit. Preservation goes beyond just archiving a rare prototype of a game or something along those lines. Last year, I commenced a preservation effort for an obscure fan game, and documented my findings for everyone to see. This preservation effort went beyond just the game or its assets. One of the bigger accomplishments I was able to achieve was archiving the now deleted forums, where users would talk and discuss ideas that never made it into the game. I know to some, it may seem silly to stress the importance of preserving something as simple as a forum from 2013, but there's genuine significance to this kind of stuff. I've been making this video for quite some time, and since the writing of this script, there have just been so many things that have been removed off the internet. Some examples are Vim's layer being completely removed off the internet, Gary's Mod scrubbing off 20 years worth of Nintendo-related content, and as I'm recording this, on 9/4 of 2024, the Internet Archive has lost its first copyright case. Like the Yuzu court case, this sets a bad precedent for the Internet Archive and grounds to completely remove it off of the internet. And such as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the incompetence and the fear of others could very well lead to the Internet Archive being gone forever. Not only do these things have historical impact, they also have emotional impact. While some of you may have never gone on these forums or websites, others have, and their memories of it are actively being erased by companies who could care less. Some of my fondest memories during my childhood was making comics on Flipnote Studio and uploading them onto Flipnote Antenna. There were so many talented creators on this application, And it was always a treat logging in just to read the newest chapter of Gravity, or watching Boss's latest stick figure fight. I actually remember these things. But Nintendo didn't really care. They shut down the servers, and all of those creations, every single one of them, became lost media. It wasn't until 2022 when the hard work and dedication of the pseudo-memo developers prevailed and the Flipnote archive launched, preserving over, no joke, 44 million Flipnotes that had been previously lost to time. It's truly fascinating seeing the dedication people put into projects such as these, and how willing they are to make sure they preserve masterpieces such as this.
Hi there, how you doing?
At the end of the day, nothing in this world lasts forever. And it's important to realize that maybe it's not so crazy to download that old video of some guy reviewing RPG Maker. Maybe it's not so crazy to download a copy of Eggs of Steel, Charlie's Excellent Adventure for the PS1. Maybe it's not so crazy to torrent AccelJoe's archive with over 10,000 tracks from various different games. Remember when that was the topic of discussion? With all of that being said, I sincerely hope that I got some sort of point across when making this video.